Thank you for downloading the book from the royalib.com free e-library, http://royalib.com. All books by the author, http://royalib.com/author/Yatsenyuk_Arseniy.html. The same book in other formats, http://book/Yatsenyuk_Arseni/Bankovskaya_Tiina_Orange_Voy_Ariemen_Oryvoluts2.html. Enjoy reading Banking Secrecy During the Orange Revolution, Arseniy Yatsenyuk. I dedicate this book to Natalia Ivanovna Grebenik. In this book, former head of the National Bank Arseniy Yatsenyuk talks about the financial crisis that was happening in Ukraine at the same time as the Orange Revolution at the end of 2004. The author chose an unusual angle. He focused on describing how the country's economy felt during the period of the most widespread political instability since the collapse of the USSR. This crisis was the worst in the history of the financial system of Ukraine, as it combined a crisis of confidence and instability of the monetary system. Already each of these components could cost the economy many years of successful development. The efforts of the national bank and commercial banks to overcome the financial crisis represent a unique experience which has never been equaled in the world economy. Throughout the 20th century, the vast majority of such shocks ended in the complete collapse of the country's banking system, followed by a multi-year economic recovery. The latest examples of financial cataclysms are found in the history of Brazil, Argentina, as well as during the global Asian crisis of 1997, the echoes of which were also felt in our country. The uniqueness of the situation in 2004 is that the Ukrainian banking system not only survived in extremely difficult conditions, but also accelerated growth immediately after the end of the Orange Revolution. It is possible that the author conceived his book as a monograph for macroeconomists and central bankers around the world. Especially for them, the actions to overcome the crisis are described in detail, as well as statistical materials reflecting the events of the autumn of 2004 in a daily context. However, thanks to a lively and accessible description of events, Arseniy Yatsenyuk managed to create a kind of economic detective story. As a result, the book is not only easily perceived, but also provides a unique understanding of the most complex macroeconomic concepts even to an unprepared reader. Author about himself. First of all, I am grateful to the family, father, mother, sister, wife, and children. And you will form an opinion about me after you read my book. Introduction. In May 2005, I called Natalia Grebenik, director of the Monetary Policy Department at the National Bank. By that time, I had been sent away from Kiev to take up the post of deputy head of the Odessa Regional State Administration. The dismissal from the National Bank took place on February 7th. It was quick and painful. However, I managed to maintain excellent relationships with many former colleagues, and we communicated periodically. In a conversation with Natalia Ivanovna, I mentioned for the first time that I wanted to write a book that would describe the crisis situation in the financial market of Ukraine in autumn-winter 2004. 3 years have passed since then. After the first deputy head of the Odessa Regional Administration, I managed to work as the Minister of Economy of Ukraine, and since September 20, 2006, I have been the first deputy head of the Presidential Secretariat. Since March 2007, he was appointed Minister of Foreign Affairs, and he got to the chairman of the Supreme Council. A small period of free time stood out only between these two appointments. I decided it was time to write a book. Despite the catastrophic employment, the work was completed. 3 years later, there are many reasons why this book was written. Chief among them is my desire to describe what happened objectively. It is no secret that history is often rewritten for themselves. Unfortunately, the same thing began to happen in this case as well. Already in the winter of 2005, when the state of the banking system returned to normal, random people began to attribute credit for overcoming the crisis to themselves. I was always surprised by their stories, and the reality looked different, and the heroes of the stories were engaged in completely different things. In this book, I want to doff all the I, and objectively describe what really happened. I really would not want the events of the autumn-winter of 2004 to be changed in the same way as the whole history of Ukraine. In the process of writing the book, I encountered a great difficulty. In the autumn-winter of 2004, the Orange Revolution took place in Ukraine, and many tend to view what was happening in the banking system through the prism of politics. My task was just the opposite, not to politicize the book. I tried to talk less about individual characters and focused on describing the situation as a whole. The specifics can be found in the comments of bankers, businessmen, and politicians who meet in the course of the presentation. He specifically asked eyewitnesses of those events to tell about their vision of events and promised to publish their point of view, even if it is different. Trying to be objective, it was worth the trouble not to create an academic work. The book would be difficult to understand and would not be of interest to anyone except scientists. Of course, the work describes events in the banking system, and simplifying the text would be the other extreme. Therefore, I decided to describe the events in a living language, so that even the most complex terms could be understood. I hope I managed to create the most convenient product that will be equally well received by both students and deputies. Surely the book will also be of interest to employees of central banks in other countries. Ukraine has demonstrated a rare example of successfully overcoming two crises in a row: currency and confidence. Especially for the experts, I have given numerical data and texts of the most significant documents that will make it possible to understand exactly how the National Bank acted in a crisis situation. I dedicate this book to Natalia Ivanovna Grebenik. I am extremely grateful to her for everything she taught me, both as a professional and as a person. There are very few people who are so dedicated to their work. Sincerely. Arseniy Yatsenyuk. Chapter 1. On Monday, November 29, 2004, the first persons of 10 largest banks of the country gathered at the National Bank. The remaining 150 institutions were represented by the Association of Ukrainian Banks. The board of the regulator was present in full force. We were going to consult how to act in the conditions of the crisis which was inevitably approaching the financial system. On my desk lay a preliminary draft of the future resolution number 576. The situation outside the windows of the National Bank at that time was revolutionary. The streets filled with demonstrators, although cars could still drive up to the building of the regulator on Institutskaya. On November 22, the second round of presidential elections ended. The opposition did not recognize its results and took its supporters to the streets. Against the backdrop of political confrontation, sharp statements were made against the financial system. On the one hand, leading politicians have said that banks are on the verge of collapse. On the other hand, they called for taking money from deposits in banks owned by oligarchs from the opposite camp. As a result, already from Friday, November 26, the population rushed to take money from banks, first in the eastern regions and then throughout the country. Some people heeded the political slogans, but the bulk of the depositors were simply frightened. There were long queues in front of ATMs and cash desks who wanted not only to withdraw their salary from the current account, but also to terminate the deposit agreement ahead of schedule. Already on Monday, the situation finally got out of control, and the banking system had to live at most a week. I think that few then realized that in the event of its collapse, the apocalypse awaited not only bankers, but the entire population. The economy would stop paying, people would not get paid. Ukraine would have returned to the early 1990s. A country without a banking system is a body suddenly devoid of blood. At first, outwardly, nothing would have changed, and the economy might even look great. But it would exist already according to the laws of the primitive communal system. The decomposition would be rapid and irreversible. Even the communists, who dreamed of creating an economy without money, eventually recognized their need. Surprisingly, I was optimistic, although for a while I did not know what to do. I had to devote some time to an express analysis of 24 financial crises that occurred in other states. This did not help much. Nothing like this happened in any country in the world. Moreover, other people's experience inspired pessimism. Crises usually ended badly for the banking system. It became clear that we can only rely on ourselves and the bankers. Circumstances were successful only in that the height of excitement among the population fell on the weekend. We got 2 days to think. Hard work was going on inside the National Bank. Every day, the board met in the large conference room across the wall from the chairman's office, and we had many hours of brainstorming. In general, the employees of the National Bank showed themselves to be real fighters. However, as the popular proverb says, the family has its black sheep. There were also a couple of people in the central office of the NBU who blocked the work and plotted. I will not name names, but I hope that these people remember how they behaved during the crisis and after it, when Vladimir Stelmak returned to the chair of the head of the National Bank. The board worked in my office, and everyone acted very clearly. A task was set, and the working group was dumped by ideas. I brought up every nuance for discussion, not relying on my own experience, although the final decision still more often had to be made by myself. Fearing a leak of information, the board deliberately did not involve the territorial branches of the NBU in the development of the anti-crisis resolution. However, we sent them telegrams asking them to send their proposals. The regions did not show any particular initiative and for the most part promptly reported to the board of the National Bank about everything that happened in the regions. A preliminary version of the anti-crisis program was already created on November 26. Subsequently, about half of the points from this document migrated to Resolution number 576. Already the original version of the document was very tough. The National Bank deliberately abandoned the recommendations and switched to the practice of strict instructions. We had to close all the holes through which money could leave the banking system. After that, board members called up and met with the heads of the largest banks many times to hone the wording. I well remember the faces of the bankers who gathered in my office at the end of November. All without exception were full of pessimism. The people who did business in the turbulent 1990s expected the system to collapse in November 2004. They differed only in forecasts of the timing when the entire system would sink. And those who managed to survive will be left with significantly reduced assets and personal fortunes. It should not be forgotten that almost all the bankers who gathered here lived through the infamous 1998 in their positions. Then, after a country default on domestic and foreign government bonds and the announcement of a forced restructuring of this debt, the National Bank also assured bankers that there would be enough money in the reserves to pay off non-residents leaving the market and the panicking population. And then he took and collapsed the course almost twice. Most of the bankers appeared at the National Bank on Saturday morning, the rest, on Sunday evening. The decisive meeting took place on the evening of Monday, November 29. It was necessary to convene the bankers quietly, almost secretly, so that the information would not be leaked to the press. For this, the database created at one time was very useful, where we entered literally all the information about them, including the phone numbers of friends. At first, I had to dictate to the guests the proposals that the National Bank had worked out, and received almost no feedback. The bankers were confused. The smell of war was in the air. The huge hall in which we gathered was illuminated to the maximum. I had the impression that the room was twilight. However, it soon began to dissipate. The bankers read the document we proposed, and excellent collective work began. By the end of the day on Saturday, the main part of the anti-crisis resolution was ready. We must pay tribute to the heads of banks. They honestly talked about the state of affairs in their institutions, hiding nothing. Many brought with them ready-made proposals for overcoming the crisis. This was the key moment. Although the National Bank started the discussion, it is wrong to assume that it is the regulator that plays the leading role in the development of Decree number 576. Initially, our project did not include many of the mechanisms that appeared in the final document. The resolution worked solely because the NBU and the banks cooperated with each other. If the regulator had applied only its own preparations, the situation could not have been kept under control. Alexander Dubilet from Privatbank and Boris Timunkin from Ukrstsbank worked most actively. The first of them, for example, proposed to reduce the speed of payments. Our banks have always been proud that money goes from one end of the country to the other in 15 minutes. In a crisis, this speed could play a trick on the bank, because in just an hour a stable institution could turn into a bankrupt. Therefore, in the draft resolution, Dubilet proposed to provide for a one-day deferral of payments. This already gave a huge increase in stability within the system. Alexander Derkak from Avel was silent for some time. He had the most difficult situation, and too active participation would have looked on his part as a defense of his interests. But then he got to work. The head of Prominvestbank, Vladimir Matvienko, never showed up at the meetings on the development of the resolution, and instead sent his deputy, Tamara Shultsenko. Alexander Sorokin from Ukrstsbank withdrew and only occasionally participated in the conversation. There were also those who did not participate in the process at all. For example, Nikolai Sugonyaka from Oschatbank had little understanding of what was happening and fell into depression. Subsequently, I had to remove him from his duties as chairman of the board because he issued a large loan bypassing the restrictions of the NBU. It was a detective story. I didn't know anything about this operation, but my office received an anonymous call the same day. The caller said that Bank had issued a loan to the Inter TV channel, and even gave the number of the payment order and the time of the operation. We checked the information and found that the money left the bank through a bypass scheme. Since the TV channel was controlled by the SDPU, the press said that the National Bank allowed the Social Democrats to steal money for the elections, and I was in the share. I had to stop such rumors by removing Sugonyaka. The loan has been cancelled. The discussion of the draft anti-crisis resolution was very heated. We spoke dry technical language, but periodically delved into the details, reached a dead end, and even switched to outright swearing. From time to time, the rhetorical "everything will fall apart to hell" sounded. I struggled to control my own emotions, although in that situation it was not easy. The key for all of us was the answer to the question, what to do with depositors. By their actions, they dehydrated the banks and put terrible pressure on the course. Alexander Dubelot suggested, let's completely ban taking deposits. Immediately, our lawyers began to convince us that this should not be done. In some ways, they were right, because the ban on early withdrawal of deposits was legally flawed, and everyone understood this. I remember that at the moment when Dubelot's proposal was made, I came up with and wrote down in the draft resolution an ideal version that would fully comply with the law. Unfortunately, it boiled down to the fact that throughout the country it was necessary to introduce a temporary administration and reappoint the chairman of the board as temporary administrators. The formal reasons for this were a drop in balances on correspondent accounts, failure to comply with all standards, and a sharp increase in loan defaults. We were afraid that the negative effect of conducting temporary administrations in each bank would be 10 times worse than from an expanded interpretation of the National Bank's rights to impose a ban on early withdrawal of deposits. It also meant withdrawing all credit lines from foreign banks. Creditors would have blocked and taken through the courts all the foreign currency of our banks. De facto, a large-scale default would take place. It would be a complete disaster which could not be justified by the legal purity of the scheme. As a result, Dubelot's proposal was included in the final text of the resolution. After discussion, many proposals had to be dismissed as inadequate. For example, at first they discussed the idea of introducing bank holidays in order to close institutions for several days. Almost immediately, I had to admit that this would only exacerbate the crisis. On the evening of Monday, November 29, we finally finished consultations with the bankers. After 6 hours of hard work, the ideas dried up, and we decided to disperse. In fact, there was a draft resolution on the table, known as number 576. NBU Deputy Chairman Alexander Schlapak and Director of the Monetary Policy Department Natalia Grebenik and I stayed in the office for some time to finalize the details. Then the project was given to the head of the legal department, Vasily Pasechnik, who turned it into a finished document by morning. I personally had to argue with Pasechnik for a very long time. He was sure that resolution number 576 could not be considered legitimate. Vasily Vasilyevich gave a practical example of how any court can cancel the validity of a document. A certain grandmother will come to withdraw the deposit ahead of schedule, and she will be refused, referring to the NBU ban. Grandmother will die right in the operating room of the bank, after which the prosecutor will come to the National Bank with a warrant to arrest the authors of the document on charges of bringing to death. Pasechnik's argument was more than reasonable, so we warned the banks that in special cases, early return of deposits still needs to be done. They themselves were interested in avoiding unpleasant situations. Representatives of the banks took the most violent depositors out of the queue, quietly gave them money, and escorted them through the emergency exit. As a lawyer with experience, I searched for a long time in the legislation and found several documents that still allowed us to do what we had in mind. As a last resort, I had in reserve more than a dozen resolutions on the operation of the banking system during a special period. We adopted these documents a few months before the start of the crisis. True, they were created specifically for the event of war. However, I was sure that the current situation can be safely considered a special period, and I told Pasechnik about it. We must pay tribute to Vasily Vasilyevich. He signed the decree, although he still had doubts about its legitimacy. At my request, the chairman of the board of one of the top 10 banks, in a court of law, actually recognized the legality of the actions of the National Bank. According to the decision received, if not resolution number 576, then a similar one in content should be adopted. This document was on my desktop in case some depositor succeeded in cancelling the NBU decision through the court and the executor would come to us. Fortunately, this did not happen. It did not occur to anyone to cancel Decree Number 576. Before dispersing, the leaders of the top 10 banks stood up and applauded for a long time. It was not a standing ovation for the National Bank. The audience applauded themselves, their determination. Decree Number 576 was the result of a common effort. Since we listened and discussed all the proposals, there was optimism and hope that the situation was thought out thoroughly. We had the main thing, a global solution. The only thing left to do was to act in a coordinated manner and follow the instructions. Of course, there was no full confidence in the effectiveness of the resolution. All without exception were gnawed by doubts. After drinking a glass of cognac, NBU Deputy Chairman Alexander Schlapak and I asked ourselves, will the measures taken be enough, will they work, will the process be manageable? After all, in addition to the bankers, there were still 14 million depositors who could react to the restrictions in a completely different way. We knew for sure that hundreds of thousands of people would come to bank branches on Monday morning to continue withdrawing billions of hryvnias from their deposits. Both the National Bank and the entire financial system of Ukraine had to pass the most serious test of strength in history. It was obvious that the most difficult thing was to extinguish the first impulse of people. They could go berserk. Most depositors lost their money in Sberbank of the USSR, and in the fall of 2004, real family tragedies could repeat themselves. I imagined how in every second apartment in Ukraine a family gathers in the kitchen, and the wife proofreads her husband, again, we only have books left. We've been deceived again. I said that the money had to be spent, to buy a TV, a car, or an apartment for my daughter. In the second half of the families it would sound, it was necessary to buy currency, now there is nothing to live for. In order to survive the first days after the introduction of the resolution, at the same meeting, on November 29, a PR campaign plan was approved. We agreed that the heads of the NBU and commercial banks will have to actively explain to the population the essence of the restrictions introduced literally from the first day of the decision. The largest banks created a common budget from which throughout December publications in the print media and placement of stories on television were to be financed. The manager of the project was Alexander Dubelet, who had undeniable authority in the eyes of all those present. In addition to the central budget, each bank relied on its own resources. The next day, November 30, the bankers gathered at the NBU for a large press conference where the central media of Ukraine were invited. That was the first time we announced to journalists about the restrictions being introduced. The tension was incredible, the whole look had to demonstrate confidence in the future, but inside it was not. Everyone waited with bated breath to see how the population would react. Within a day or two, it should either storm the banks or finally calm down. Chapter 2. 2004 Economic Environment. Ukraine considered a tiger. In 2003 to 2004, Ukraine was called nothing less than the Eastern European tiger, by analogy with the Asian tigers, South Korea, Malaysia, Singapore. The pace of development of our country was high even in comparison with other transitional economies. In 2003, the gross domestic product grew by 9.6%, and in 2004 by 12.1%. Observations showed that the shadow economy was developing at a similar pace, which in size was approximately 60% of the legal one. Only China or India has demonstrated such successes. Ukraine's macroeconomic performance was the envy of the whole world. Production in the country developed at a tremendous pace, providing the receipt of record volumes of foreign currency, the growth of household incomes and the rapid development of the banking sector. The statistics sound dry, but any resident of Ukraine could say that the country has changed a lot since the beginning of the new century. There was no longer a total food shortage and savings devouring inflation. The country had a really reliable national currency, the hryvnia. The state budget has been successfully implemented since 2000, and the vertical of power has worked quite smoothly. The incomes of the population gradually increased, although even today in the regions there is a large number of people living below the poverty line. Macroeconomic postulates say that the state of the economy can negatively affect the banking system and the exchange rate of the national currency only if problems such as a negative current account balance or production stagnation exist for a very long time. But in Ukraine, before the 2004 crisis, everything was exactly the opposite. Of course, prices rose at a faster rate than in developed countries. It was impossible to get away from this. It is believed that inflation of up to 10% per year is beneficial for the development of any transitional economy, since it increases corporate profits, and with them, the general well-being of the nation. In Ukraine, inflation at the level of 8% per year was considered a natural payment for existing shortcomings. Prices rose due to constant disproportions in the development of industries and sectors caused by the existence of natural monopolies and an imperfect structure of public administration. In both 2003 and 2004, due to shortages and inaction on the part of the authorities, the prices of food products, bread, meat, eggs, and milk, rose in price. Prices for other groups of goods rose as well. Inflation was imported into the country from abroad. It arose as a result of Ukraine's dependence on external factors and risks. For example, energy resources are imported from Russia while Moscow focuses on world markets. Another significant pro-inflationary factor is the appreciation of the euro against the dollar, to which the hryvnia is actually pegged. A third of imports to Ukraine comes from the eurozone. Euro inflation added about 2% to our consumer price index. In addition, already in 2004, a trend was evident which fully manifested itself in 2005. Effective demand exceeded the supply of goods. The Ukrainian economy was not able to produce enough products in a short time to compensate for the increase in incomes of the population. At the same time, the government could not meet the demand of the population through the import component because this would require significant changes in legislation. The only salvation in this situation could be banks and investment funds that would accumulate surplus money and invest it. However, in the conditions of the Ukrainian economy, this was basically impossible. As a result, the country experienced a classic demand pull inflation. And yet, despite the rapid development and disproportions, in 2003 the price increase was quite acceptable, 8.2%. In 2004, inflation exceeded single digits and amounted to 12.3%. This was the first year of extremely high price growth since the 1998 Asian crisis was overcome. Still, I admit that inflation would certainly have been lower had it not been for the 2004 political crisis. It's no secret that this huge rise in prices was provoked by a sharp increase in government social spending. Of course, the Ukrainian economy had many problems. The main one is huge sectoral disproportions. Most sectors have been in decline since Ukraine's independence. The driving force behind the development of the economy for many years remained heavy industries, among which metallurgy, chemistry, and mechanical engineering stood out. In 2003, industrial production increased by 15.8%, and in 2004 by 12.5%. Such an enviable pace was accompanied by large investments in fixed assets. They grew by 31.3% and 28%, respectively. Despite the approaching presidential elections, large enterprises updated equipment, built new buildings. They did not expect trouble from political trials. Real shocks were needed to reduce the optimism of the producers. And so it happened, but a year later. First, the autumn crisis, and then, as it is now, the shock therapy from the government of Yulia Tymoshenko led to the fact that in 2005 capital investments increased by only 1.9%. It was already a clear sign of stagnation. But that was later. There should be no illusions. In 2004, everyone understood that Ukraine was demonstrating record rates of development solely due to the good situation in foreign markets. Large exporting enterprises, mainly metallurgical and chemical plants, took full advantage of the good market conditions. During the 11 months of 2004, the export of ferrous metals increased by 57.9%, metal structures and chemical products, by 40%, the engineering industry sold abroad by 60% more. The final balance of foreign trade in goods and services for the 11 months of 2004 amounted to $4.76 billion, 3.3 times more than a year earlier. In the first quarter of 2003, the share of exports in GDP was 69.3%. Already at the beginning of 2004, this figure rose to 81%. Admittedly, these figures were significantly inflated due to fictitious transactions. In particular, due to pseudo-export, when the export of goods was declared and passed according to customs statistics, but no physical delivery was carried out. This was done to obtain VAT refunds from the state budget. At the same time, the volume of imports was underestimated. In order not to pay duties and VAT, when importing goods, their lower value was declared, and some of the goods were completely smuggled. Thus, a record-high positive balance of the current account of the balance of payments was obtained, which in reality did not exist. We at the National Bank understood the true state of affairs and took this into account in our work. All international experts with whom I had to communicate agreed that with such a large positive current account balance in the country, there can be no talk of devaluation. On the contrary, they convinced the National Bank that a revaluation was necessary. I have had to prove personally that the issue of an excessively positive balance lies not so much in the plane of macroeconomics as it relates to the distortion of statistics due to shadow operations. In such circumstances, it is impossible to make confident exchange rate forecasts. Nevertheless, it must be admitted that export earnings were the main source of development of the country's economy in 2000 to 2004. The foreign currency imported in large volumes by exporters was used to raise wages, purchase new equipment, or simply buy real estate and cars. And this was already a prerequisite for the creation of domestic demand, an alternative source of economic development to exports. One of the clear signs of the enrichment of the nation is the active revival of the construction industry, as well as the growing import of new cars into the country. I will make a reservation right away that the National Bank took the ongoing processes critically. Large investments in consumer goods are a problem for Ukraine. Only in a dysfunctional economy can a nation afford to buy expensive new cars, especially on credit. In developed countries, all sane people invest in increasing family capital. The USA, Great Britain, France have been moving towards the current level of prosperity for centuries. There is a culture of capital formation there. In these states, billionaires drive old Oldsmobiles because all the money is invested in the cause. In Ukraine, instead of a culture of formation, there is a culture of burning capital. Instead of the desire to increase, there is a desire to spend. And on credit. It is very strange that today this is presented as a positive trend. Indeed, in the US and Europe, everyone lives on credit. But there the degree of economic development is completely different. It is very difficult to find an untapped niche for starting a business there. There are still many investment opportunities in Ukraine. Another thing is that in our country the conditions for a competent investment of money have not been created. The conditions for starting your own business are extremely difficult, and as a result, the savings of Ukrainians are distributed among three instruments: currency, bank deposits, and real estate. This is another problem of our nation, and it has not been resolved to this day. Against the backdrop of a growing economy, even in October 2004, no one expected a crisis. Government delegations from Ukraine, which necessarily included representatives of the National Bank, then traveled all over the world. Huge halls gathered in Western Europe to listen to what First Deputy Prime Minister Mykola Azarov or First Deputy Head of the National Bank Arseniy Yatsenyuk would say. Experts from international organizations and businessmen from different countries unanimously declared, Ukraine has a great future. Our speeches only strengthened faith in a cloudless tomorrow. The benefits of the trips were at least that international investors were happy to buy government bonds of Ukraine on the external and internal markets. In 2003, 10-year Eurobonds for $1 billion were placed with a record low yield of 7.65% per annum. In March 2004, they managed to reach an even lower rate, 6.875%, under which the government raised $600 million. Even on the eve of the elections, in the summer of 2004, investors bought Ukraine's 5-year Eurobonds for another $500 million. Non-residents actively brought foreign currency to Ukraine, converted it into hryvnia, and bought government bonds and VAT government bonds, investing $407 million in these securities over the year. None of them even thought that the elections scheduled for autumn could somehow interfere with development economy or shake the hryvnia exchange rate. The government did not believe in it either. Experts of all levels unanimously asserted that the country's economy and political sphere live separately from each other. Analysts of the National Bank predicted that over the past 3 or 4 months, the currency will leave the country for a maximum of $1 billion. This was a rather pessimistic assessment. She took into account the fact that by the end of 2004 the working conditions in foreign markets had already worsened. By autumn, prices for metal and chemical products fell, sharply reducing the profits of Ukrainian enterprises. According to the results of 9 months of 2004, the share of exports in GDP decreased to 56.8%. Industrial production began to gradually slow down growth. And yet, the basis for economic growth, created in the first 9 months of 2004, turned out to be more than solid. Given such a backlog, it was impossible even to assume the onset of a crisis in the economy. There was more than enough money in the banking system, and the decline in foreign exchange earnings of exporters could not become a catalyst for the autumn financial crisis. From January to September alone, the NBU bought out almost $4.6 billion, issuing $25 billion in return. In another country, such an influx of money into the financial system would lead to massive inflation. However, the Ukrainian economy was so short of money that it absorbed almost half of it harmlessly. The second was collected by the National Bank. It regularly pumped out excess liquidity from the system. Given that the NBU bought out $4.6 billion, there was no threat to the financial system even in the most dire forecasts. The government and the National Bank looked to the future with confidence. It was only at the end of October, under the pressure of completely unexpected circumstances, that the forecast for an outflow of a maximum of $1 billion was erroneous. The financial crisis in the autumn of 2004 was provoked exclusively by political factors. The country's economy and the banking system in that period showed very good performance. They ensured that the year ended well, even if the production dynamics during the autumn-winter period turned out to be sluggish. Only careless statements by politicians, attempts to create autonomous republics within Ukraine, and calls to take money from banks controlled by oligarchs from the opposite camp could bring down positive trends. If it were not for all this, the financial system would have survived even the unrest typical of the election period in the foreign exchange market, as well as a temporary shortage of the hryvnia in the accounts. Illiteracy is the main systemic risk. At the end of one anecdote about doctors, there is a wonderful phrase: the patient's condition is stable, but serious. It was this diagnosis that could be put on the banking system, which at the end of 2002, Sergei Tijipko received from Vladimir Stelmak. At first glance, there was order in the sector controlled by the NBU, but in the depths, a number of dangerous hidden trends were developing. As you know, the chronic problems of the banking system are not visible for a long time. They come to the surface only when the bank collapses. Prior to this, the processes can take decades, and the average duration of the formation of banking problems is 3 years. Over the course of 3 years, defaults are gradually issued, old debts are paid off at the expense of new debts, the interest rate on attracting increases, the length of deposits is reduced, the gap in terms between assets and liabilities increases, and just before the denouement, the founders withdraw their money because they foresee the inevitable crash. Dozens of such processes were observed in the Ukrainian banking system. That is why we said that in general the state of the system was stable, but in some institutions it was difficult. Knowing this, our team developed a comprehensive program for the development of the banking system for 2 years and began to implement it. By the middle of 2004, the most significant risk factors had either been eliminated or did not carry any special danger. The banking system entered the crisis in November-December 2004, having a large margin of safety. Only enumeration of problems in 2003 occupied not a single printed sheet of paper. First of all, we were concerned about the discrepancy between the growth rates of banks' assets and capital. There were almost no systems of corporate governance and risk control, especially currency and liquidity. The regulator did not have complete information about the state of banks, confirmed by auditors. Massive loans were issued to related persons. Most of the top managers in the system had extremely low qualifications. There was an acute problem of small banks, in which all of the above difficulties existed simultaneously. Separate institutions were engaged in laundering operations on a grand scale, and many, from time to time. Contact was not established between the NBU and self-regulatory organizations, the Association of Ukrainian Banks and the Kiev Banking Union. A separate problem was the state of Oschadbank. The main problem was the lack of proper management in banks. A healthy system of corporate relations provides that the owners of the institution appoint top managers who professionally run the business and make a profit. Then it is paid in the form of dividends and causes an increase in the market value of the shares. To prevent managers from abusing power in their own interests, the owners create a supervisory board that approves major transactions. Top managers, in turn, create a clear internal management structure that allows them to delegate authority and responsibility to subordinates. However, in Ukrainian conditions, all this, if it existed, was only formal. The professionalism of the top managers of most banks was extremely low. The internal management structure was based on an intuitive understanding of processes. In order to encourage managers to improve their professionalism, we have developed a whole set of amendments to the law on banks and banking activity. In particular, in Article 42, we propose to prescribe a procedure for checking the heads of institutions for professional suitability. The regulator wanted to categorically prohibit the appointment to leading positions of persons who, by their actions in the past, brought the bank to bankruptcy or simply worsened its financial condition. The changes were developed in early 2004, but the Verkhovna Rada did not support them. I had to get out of the situation, making adjustments to the internal instructions of the NBU. Within the framework of the entire system, the interference of bank owners in the work of managers was borne by great risks. There were two common models of relationships between top managers and owners. According to the first one, the shareholders considered the bank to be one of the links of their financial industrial group, FIG. In this case, the owners did not pay much attention to the profitability of the bank and cared more about the efficiency of the system as a whole. At the same time, they, of course, demanded from the financial institution special working conditions for their own. In particular, such a bank massively issued loans to related parties without analyzing the risks for each individual project. The danger was that loans were issued at the expense of funds that were raised from the population and enterprises that were not part of the FIG. If the bank went bankrupt, they would be the ones who would suffer. In addition, the bank underestimated the fees for servicing related parties and charged high rates on their deposits. As a result of this practice, the bank's profits were eaten up, and there was nothing for it to increase its capital. This phenomenon was quite common, given that there are hundreds of FIGs in Ukraine. From the first model of relations, the second one flowed. Since the bank was not making a profit, one day it had to stop lending. The fact is that the growth of capital did not keep pace with the increase in the assets of the banking system. In 2002 and 2003, the increase in loans was 60 to 70% and capital increased by less than 30%. With such rates already at the end of 2003, the norms of the National Bank would not allow issuing loans. Further, it would be even more difficult, because the regulator decided to further tighten its requirements. Since March 2004, the NBU has deliberately raised the adequacy standard to 10% in order to increase the reliability of controlled institutions and encourage them to earn more profit. Prior to this, we required a ratio of a bank's regulatory capital to its risk-weighted assets to be at least 8%. Raising the capital adequacy ratio was given to the NBU very hard. I had to convince not only the press and bankers, but also judges of the usefulness of the innovation. Kiev Banking Union, led by the owner of Pravex Bank, Leonid Chernovetsky, many times challenged the legality of the decision of the NBU. Only in November 2005, the Supreme Court recognized the final correctness of the regulator. One can understand the disappointment of Chernovetsky, who stubbornly did not want to spend money on the capitalization of his bank. At that time, almost the only way to increase capital for a pocket bank was to ask shareholders to increase the authorized capital. However, for the owners, the manager's request sounded wild. They sincerely believed that a bank is an enterprise like any other, and should earn enough to grow on its own. It turned out a vicious circle. On the one hand, the owners did not allow the bank to earn money, and on the other hand, they did not give money for development. It was only in 2005 that shareholders learned to get a return from the bank, not in the form of dividends, but from an increase in capitalization. The owners saw that much more could be earned from the growth in the value of the bank's shares than from the distribution of its profits. In 2005, some Ukrainian banks were sold with multiples to equity of 1:5, which is more than in Eastern Europe. For example, the coefficient for Ukrsbank is estimated, according to various sources, from 4.8 to 6, and for Indexbank, from 6.38 to 7.19. It was at this stage that all the benefits of capitalization manifested themselves. In 2003 to 2004, we urged bank owners not to live for today, but to work for the future. Those who understood this earned 1:5. However, most owners did not hear us. In order for them to realize the advantages of capitalization, several transactions had to take place to sell banks to foreigners and to list part of the shares on the stock exchange. Both that and another has occurred only in 2005. There was nothing to blame them for. because even the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development did not understand us. In 2003, I urged them to enter the capital of Ukrainian banks through the mechanism of IPO or private sale. The EBRD would have earned billions in just a couple of years, and the banks would have received a plus in the form of technology and the presence of a world-famous owner. I personally went out with a similar proposal to the president of the bank, Jean Lemire, but they did not believe me. Time has shown how much they have lost. I do not rule out that with the participation of the EBRD in the capital, banks in 2005 to 2006 would have been sold with ratios of 1:7. Ukrainian top managers and owners usually found a compromise in the use of schemes. Shareholders contributed money to the statutory fund and immediately withdrew it through loans to related enterprises. In addition to this, banks finished capital. One of the common methods is the revaluation of fixed assets. Often accrued but not yet received income was taken into account. In addition, banks showed the issued loan as being of better quality than it actually was in order to form smaller reserves for this active operation. For example, when it was necessary to reduce profit by 20% of the loan amount, they only reduced it by 5%. This could not but affect the reliability of the bank. He looked like a man with a bloated body on thin legs. In order to mitigate systemic risks, the NBU set a goal to make it as difficult as possible to use capital inflation schemes, as well as to complicate the issuance of loans to related parties. To this end, we adopted several important resolutions throughout 2004. The development of all documents was carried out by the Deputy Chairman of the NBU Alexander Schlapak and the General Department of Banking Supervision controlled by him. On April 29, 2004, Resolution number 192 on amendments to certain regulations of the NBU was signed. By this document, since December, we have prohibited banks from accounting for certain types of shares, investments in the capital of related institutions and subordinated debt provided to other banks as part of capital. Insider dealings were hit particularly hard. The decree forbade all transactions that were carried out with related parties on especially favorable terms to be included in capital. In addition, the regulator has tightened the requirements for banks to comply with the norms for transactions with insiders, N9 and N10, and for transactions with one person, N7. It was calculated that the resolution cleared the bank's capital by UAH 760 million. According to a good tradition, for a long time banks did not understand which deposits and loans should be considered especially profitable. Having received many stupid letters, in August the General Department of Supervision developed an explanatory letter in which it reminded the banks that each of them is obliged to create an internal regulation that should clearly answer such questions. In particular, the document must separate preferential transactions with insiders from ordinary transactions in order to deduct them from capital. So that banks could no longer not understand, the supervision in its own way prescribed clear signs of preferential treatment. It was possible to determine such a transaction not only by the price, which was very different from the usual one, but also by whether payments were made at all. Often clients on the street would pay commissions when granting a loan, while insiders might not. By autumn, the fashion for operations with related parties at special prices had come to naught. The next after the 192nd was Resolution number 267, on approval of amendments to the Instruction on the Procedure for Regulating the Activities of Banks in Ukraine, dated June 17, 2004. With this document, we removed from the capital of banks the amount of revaluation of fixed assets and accrued but not paid income. Banks were particularly resistant to this ruling. In this way, capital was inflated by systemic institutions with a huge number of buildings and furniture. In total, the capital of banks decreased by another UAH 270 million, and we demanded that all previously carried out revaluations be subject to examination by the NBU. Tightening the requirements for capitalization, the NBU came under fire from the press, owners, and managers of banks. However, we did not regret that the capital of banks was decreasing, because this made the entire financial system much more stable. In the end, after the tantrums, the banks found money to replenish the authorized funds. By the middle of 2004, their capitals were growing at about the same pace as their assets. However, sometimes the criticism was well-deserved. For example, in October 2004, we proposed to force banks, which have more than a quarter of assets of unsatisfactory quality, to buy government bonds and put them on a block account. The idea, it would seem, was not bad, to ensure greater stability of banks, so that they have money to return deposits to the population in case of bankruptcy. However, practice has shown that the ideology of reserves is somewhat different. They have already been formed in other assets, even in bad ones. If we had implemented our requirement, the banks would have been backed up twice. I had to abandon this idea, including because of criticism in the press, but the NBU ignored the indignation when it had to solve the problem of savings banks. With particular grace, controlled institutions circumvented the norm on assigning them a burdensome status. According to the current requirements, a savings institution is considered to be an institution whose share of household deposits in liabilities exceeds 50%. The special status was unfavorable for banks because it implied a number of restrictions. In particular, 4 out of 15 activity standards have been tightened for savings banks, H4, H7, H9, and H10. They should have more free money on hand and on a correspondent account than an ordinary bank. In addition, for savings banks, the maximum loan amount that they can issue in one hand has been significantly reduced. Institutions are squeezed in transactions with insiders. Formally, all these restrictions are fair, because Sberbank has a much higher responsibility to depositors. However, in practice it was really inconvenient. Banks tried to increase liabilities in order not to fall into a disadvantageous category. For example, 2 candidates for a special status issued counter-interbank loans to each other. We decided to stop this practice and at the same time slightly soften the requirements for savings banks. On September 15, 2004, Resolution number 443 appeared, which spelled out a detailed mechanism for transferring an institution to an unpleasant category. The NBU has differentiated the requirements for the issuance of a loan by a Sberbank in one hand, depending on how many loans of poor quality are in the bank's assets. The regulator specifically stipulated that the new N7, N9, and N10 standards apply only to new and extended loans. Unfortunately, the restrictions came into force only at the beginning of 2005, and we did not have time to assess how effective they turned out to be. The NBU tried to introduce corporate governance systems in banks. In January 2004, the General Department of Banking Supervision sent out guidelines on the organization and operation of risk management systems in Ukrainian banks. In particular, they spelled out the principles of creating the correct organizational structure of the institution and sharing responsibility for decision-making among managers. Particular emphasis was placed on the fact that managers should be subject to minimal influence from the owners. Methodical recommendations were created consciously. We understood that large banks had already spent tens of millions of dollars on the introduction of risk management systems, while small and medium-sized banks did not have the money to pay for the services of Western consultants who would help build business processes correctly. This meant the instability of the entire system. The NBU Supervision Department, led by Vadim Pushkarev, consulted for a long time with experts from the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, studied their experience and tried to adapt it to Ukrainian conditions. As a result, a practical manual was created specifically for small and medium-sized institutions. The document was advisory in nature, but since 2003 we have been trying to force banks to be more attentive to the most sensitive areas of work. For example, we introduced the basic requirements for the organization of operational activities and internal control in institutions. In parallel, seminars on risk management were held for bank managers and NBU supervisors. So, step by step, we removed systemic imbalances that could one day lead to a large-scale crisis. Banks strongly protested against the introduction by the NBU Supervisory Department of the system of indicators of early response. It was a set of indicators and ratios, thanks to which the regional departments of the National Bank could track dangerous trends in the activities of controlled institutions. The system, introduced in 2003, greatly facilitated the work of supervision because it was possible not to resort to on-site inspections, but to draw accurate conclusions based on ordinary reporting. Banks were wary of the early response indicators because the methodology for calculating them, of course, was not made public. They experienced the whole gamut of feelings of the defendant, who did not know what was recorded in his personal file. And, of course, they were indignant when, based on the calculated indicators, the NBU threatened to apply sanctions. The Association of Ukrainian Banks and the Kiev Banking Union asked to give them a system of indicators for analysis or, even better, to cancel it altogether. Naturally, we did neither. The maximum concession that our team made was the promise that the scorecard would not be the basis for sanctions. That is, there must be some other facts confirming that the bank has problems. This meant conducting a scheduled or unscheduled inspection, forced hardening. The daily work of banks has become a special subject of audit by the NBU. For example, the regulator was very worried about the issue of currency risks. At the end of 2003, the NBU board allowed to issue loans to the population in foreign currency. This was a forced step, since hard currency loans were already being issued in full swing through payment cards. We just legitimized the mechanism by removing useless restrictions. Immediately I had to think about the presence of systemic risk. Banks were too active in lending to individuals in foreign currency. This could create problems, because most of the population received income in the hryvnia. In order to pay interest on foreign currency loans, people had to go to exchange offices or bank cash desks, purchase dollars or euros, and only then make a loan installment. This situation became dangerous because the dependence of the banking system on exchange rate stability sharply increased. Even a slight devaluation of the hryvnia would complicate the servicing of foreign currency loans and, possibly, would provoke massive defaults. The National Bank did not have the right to let the situation take its course, and on June 29, 2004, it adopted the famous Resolution No. 300. With this document, we proposed changing the provision on the procedure for creating a reserve to compensate for possible losses on bank lending operations. It was assumed that for the issued foreign currency loans, banks would have to form a larger reserve. In other words, reduce profits by a large amount. To do this, we proposed to lower the class of a borrower who received a loan in foreign currency but did not have stable foreign exchange earnings by one level. As you know, depending on solvency, borrowers are divided into 5 classes of reliability. The higher the risk of non-return, the larger the reservation should be. In the most critical case, by issuing a bad loan, the bank must deduct the full amount of the loan from capital, excluding the value of the collateral. This operation is called 100% redundancy. For comparison, for loans of the highest quality, capital is reduced by only 1% of the amount issued. Naturally, banks have always tried to embellish the quality of loans so as not to spoil their performance. One could understand their indignation, because, if the decision was adopted, they would have to reduce their capital. In addition, we demanded that banks not deduct the value of collateral received from risky borrowers from the loan amount. That is, they must provide a pledge, but according to the reporting, it would not pass. This meant that reserves should be calculated from the full amount of the loan, and not from its small part. It was a kind of provocation on the part of the NBU. We deliberately entered into a conflict with the banks, in order to then retreat to pre-prepared positions. I personally wrote the text of Decree No. 300, realizing that everyone would protest against it, both the press and the financial sector. And so it happened. The NBU was criticized mercilessly. On July 20, 2004, we met with the bankers, apologized and withdrew the resolution for revision. It is wrong to exclude collateral from the collateral calculation because collateral is a liquid instrument. In this part, we went too far, I admitted then. Immediately, the NBU board sat down at the negotiating table with the bankers and agreed on conditions that suited both us and them. The outcome of the meeting was the August Decree No. 411, which since March 2005 introduced restrictions in the required format. The document provided for the easing of provisioning for hryvnia loans, while the conditions for provisioning for foreign currency loans remained the same. The ordinance is still in effect. It should be said that voluntary associations of banks, AUB and KBS, actively participated in all the debates. By the decision of Secrecy, the NBU board necessarily coordinated with them almost all important decisions related to the regulation of the system. Unfortunately, after the return of Vladimir Stelmak, this practice was abandoned. Having come to the NBU, our team discovered another big problem, the mismatch between the assets and liabilities of banks in terms of length. In 2002 to 2003, a typical situation was when short money, for a maximum of a month, was borrowed on the interbank market to issue loans for a period of more than a year. Most of the institutions were oriented at all to overnight resources. In the theory of banking management, this phenomenon is called the liquidity gap, or gap. Gaps carry a huge risk. If the resources in the market disappear, the bank has nothing to cover the suddenly appeared hole in liabilities. Nothing better than the case when the resource suddenly rises in price. Then the issuance of loans at the expense of the interbank becomes unprofitable. In the worst-case scenario, both examples may end in bankruptcy of the institution. And the fall of a large bank can cause a domino effect throughout the financial system. In part, the situation in the economy was in favor of the scheme of working with gaps. In 2002 and 2003, it was possible to buy enough free hryvnia at a meager price on the resource market any day. Until the autumn of 2003, there was not a single crisis in which rates soared to at least 20% per annum. On the contrary, for a long time they remained at the level of 0.1% per annum. The donors were systemic banks, which served the state, the population, and many enterprises, especially metallurgical ones. These are Prominvestbank, Aval, Ukrstsbank, Ukreximbank. Many banks made money by borrowing from some institutions and lending to others. This increased the risks in the system as a whole. Both large and small banks did not even seek to manage risks. Having become accustomed to the cheapness and abundance of resources on the market, they carelessly increased their investment portfolios. Gaps were especially abused by medium-sized institutions that did not want to lag behind large banks in terms of development. This was partly a forced step. The shareholders demanded that the bank earn its own capital. The treasurer's typical working day consisted of assessing the level of interest rates in the resource market and calculating how many clients could be granted loans using money from the interbank market. Moreover, decisions were made on the basis of data on the cost of the night hryvnia. The logic was like this. If the cost of overnight loans over the past 6 months was no more than 5 to 6% per annum, usually not rising above 1 to 2%, and loans to the economy at the same time were issued at 20 to 24%, then it was possible to take risks. The treasurer assumed that even when the cost of the overnight hryvnia soared to 20%, he would have to endure a maximum of several days. And if the period of expensive money drags on, it will be possible to attract expensive deposits from the population. Thus, the risk management system was reduced to reasoning. According to the treasurers, everything should be fine if the state does not pull too much money into the treasury account, if the population does not spend too much on buying goods, if confidence in the banking system is not undermined, if the exchange rate does not change, and so on. However, for a banker, more than 2 IFS is already a direct road to a crisis. Since the arrival of the new team, the National Bank has often spoken about the danger of gaps. We sent out letters and telegrams in which we recommended that banks switch to more solid liabilities, household deposits, internal and external long-term borrowings. However, the banks hardly reacted to our warnings. Everything changed dramatically in November 2003, when the government pulled too much money into a single account at the Treasury, effectively withdrawing it from the country's financial system. After 2 years of abundance, suddenly there was a sharp shortage of resources, and interest rates on the interbank market soared upwards. The cost of the night hryvnia reached 70% per annum. In dealing systems, the indicative level of 100% even slipped. Most of the transactions between large banks were carried out at about 30% per annum. The NBU was then accused of inaction, that it did not provide refinancing to everyone who wanted it on time. We really delayed a little with the decision, but we understood that nothing threatened the banking system. Shock therapy produced a sobering effect. After the liquidity crisis, banks began to take the planning of active-passive operations very seriously. Large institutions began to enter foreign markets, while smaller institutions began to issue bonds and attract deposits from the population. According to the results of 2003, the balances of funds on the accounts of natural persons increased by 67.7%. Attracting long-term, for a period of more than a year, deposits grew at a faster pace. Shortly before this, another event happened that made the banks think. In August 2003, an unpleasant situation occurred. The collapse of our bank began. On the morning of June 18, the director of the Monetary Policy Department, Natalia Grebenik, called me and said, "We have a problem." It turned out that Dnipropetrovsk, our bank, did not return the NBU 7.5 million hryvnia, which the night before took as refinancing. I immediately ordered to freeze the movement of money on bank accounts until the circumstances were clarified. Thanks to this, it was possible to save a significant part of the funds, which then went to pay the victims. By June 18, the institution borrowed tens of millions of hryvnias on the interbank market. Immediately after the introduction of sanctions by the NBU, creditors demanded the return of their money, and thanks to us, almost everything was returned. The population was less fortunate. Ordinary depositors received only those amounts that were repaid by the Deposit Guarantee Fund. The rest of the funds are gone. The audit confirmed the worst fears. The bank's management, at the direction of the owners, began to withdraw money from it through the issuance of bad loans. In Ukrainian conditions, this is exactly how the shareholders behave, who see that the institution will soon collapse. This development of events was surprising for us, because the system of early response indicators did not show threatening trends. Later it turned out that the bank statements had been falsified for a long time, and the husband of one of the employees of our bank, who worked in the territorial department of the NBU, managed to cover it up. The board of the National Bank initiated an internal investigation and tried for a long time to negotiate with the old and possible new owners. For some time there was hope that new shareholders would appear who would give money and save the bank. However, then we realized that the only goal of the owners is to play for time in order to take some more money. The NBU board decided to start the liquidation procedure, refusing to issue a stabilization loan and refinancing to the institution. We realized that it is impossible to delay time in such situations. We need a quick and tough response. Practice has shown that this is the only way to save money, and there is even a certain probability of keeping the bank afloat. The collapse of our bank benefited the entire financial system. After that, a wave of revision of limits on interbank transactions swept through large institutions. Many systemic banks stopped working with small institutions, considering them too unstable. Despite temporary difficulties, everyone benefited from the restriction of mutual lending. Systemic banks secured themselves, while small ones learned to plan raising money more competently and rely less on the resource market. Another unpleasant trend was connected with the interbank market, which was clearly manifested in November 2003. NBU reporting assumed that banks report on the formation of required reserves once a month. In reality, compliance with the standard was monitored once every 10 days. This led to the fact that during the month individual banks kept the minimum amount of hryvnia on correspondent accounts. But on the last day of the decade, and especially the month, on the so-called transitions, they tried to borrow so much money on the market in order to reach the desired monthly average. These days were always characterized by a sharp surge in interest rates on the depot market and the emergence of a great demand for NBU refinancing. On the other hand, the value of money fell the very next day. In March 2004, I sent out a letter outlining the problem. According to NBU statistics, 71 out of 158 banks took resources on the depot market at inflated prices. The reason for this behavior was the incorrect management of liabilities. The unprofessionalism of top managers of banks led to large fluctuations in interest rates. As a result, loans to the economy became more expensive and systemic risks increased. In November 2003, the drops were the most destructive. They coincided with the outflow of funds to the state treasury and led to the rise in interbank rates to 70 to 100% per annum. To combat market fluctuations, the director of the Monetary Policy Department, Natalia Grebenik, proposed introducing daily reservations. In March-April, we developed and verified with the banks a draft resolution on the procedure for the formation of required reserves. According to this document, from July 1, 2004, institutions had to keep on their correspondent accounts every day at least 60% of the daily norm. Later, the level was changed by a separate resolution of the NBU. We made the new procedure quite soft, allowing banks to allow under reserve up to 30 days per quarter. Of course, the value of money, in transition, is still growing, because banks do not know until the last day how much money will go to their accounts. Therefore, they usually have to borrow the missing amount only when reporting. In addition, the Ministry of Finance and budget appropriators are still not cured of the bad habit of throwing money into the banking system at the beginning of the month and pulling it back at the end. It also spurs interest rates on hryvnia-denominated resources. And yet, in general, as we expected, interest rate fluctuations on the interbank market have sharply decreased since then. The state of the market before and after the introduction of the daily minimum balance differed significantly, and the country's financial system began to work more stably. The mere fact that every day you need to keep a certain amount in the accounts has dramatically increased the professionalism and responsibility of the treasurers of all banks without exception. We understood that it would not be possible to completely eliminate the gaps. The golden rule of Vladimir Stelmach, which states that assets must match liabilities in terms of length, cannot be met. From time immemorial, the essence of the banking business has been to collect short deposits and issue long loans. An obligatory element of such work is trust on the part of investors. In principle, there can be no complete balance. Hence, the banking business is reduced to the ability to cover gaps through various financial instruments. At the same time, the NBU saw that banks would not be able to fill gaps on their own due to the lack of instruments on the market. Therefore, he decided to strengthen the role of the regulator as a lender of last resort by creating clear rules for refinancing. At the end of 2003, Natalia Grebenik and I revised the entire regulatory framework that regulated the active operations of the National Bank and combined it into a new regulation on the NBU regulation of the liquidity of Ukrainian banks through refinancing, deposit and other operations. The document was published on December 24, 2003 and entered into force in March 2004. At the same time, we cancelled the disparate decrees that were in force before. Commercial banks were involved in the development of the document, which were supposed to become the final consumers of the regulator's services. Thanks to cooperation, the situation turned out to be very correct in terms of practical suitability. For example, it solved such an issue as confirmation of receipt of an application for refinancing. Previously, the computer accepted applications only until 10.00, and then cut them off. As a result, the bankers had to look for Arseniy Yatsenyuk, who would personally allow them to issue money. The prescribed procedures saved everyone from this and other problems. We listed clear criteria for allowing banks to refinance and cut off from our money those of them that did not meet the basic standards. For the first time, our document spelled out in detail the procedure for issuing stabilization loans. In the autumn of 2004, it turned out that in practice it was of little use, but before that, the NBU board considered the procedure ideal. The lengthening of the terms of loans issued by the regulator up to 365 days has become revolutionary. We actively used refinancing through the instrument of direct currency repo, actual swap, through which in 2004 we managed to give the system UAH 3.5 billion. Compared to 0.4 billion a year earlier, the classical swap operation was hindered by the pension fund fee, which then amounted to 1.5% of the amount of the purchased currency. To circumvent its effect, we came up with a tricky scheme that involved the use of collateral. As a result, the operation had to be called repo. All the instruments specified in the regulation, under which refinancing was issued, were actively used. The National Bank accepted bonds of the state, local authorities and enterprises, bills of exchange, claims on loans, certificates of deposit. It was inconvenient, but we took risks because the banks were severely limited in their ability to receive money. Certainly, it was necessary to be reinsured. The National Bank checked the issuers of bonds and bills, conducted an additional audit so as not to rely on stock quotes, which were easy to regulate. Bills of exchange were discounted at a 50% discount, and before that, written consent had to be obtained from all participants in the bill of exchange, so that there would be no sudden obstacles to the exercise of the right of recourse. It was also necessary to check the financial condition of each of the endorsers. However, we still accepted bills and issued money against them. Unfortunately, warehouse receipts and mortgages were not used, because the government did not create the necessary bylaws for the circulation of these types of securities. We also had to close the mechanism of long-term refinancing for up to 3 years almost from the start. In February 2003, the National Bank adopted a temporary regulation on the procedure for long-term refinancing, on the basis of which it issued about 1 billion hryvnias for several pilot projects. In fact, our money was used to complete the construction of power units at the Khmelnytsky and Rovno nuclear power plants, and to repair the Kiev-Odessa highway. We have proved that the mechanism of long-term refinancing is quite applicable. Even before the start of the project, the National Bank was heavily criticized for the very idea of financing global projects through unsecured hryvnia issuance. Experts from the International Monetary Fund said that lending to the economy is not the function of the central bank. In the end, we agreed with the IMF. The NBU promised that it would not lend directly, but would only refinance commercial banks. Thus, the regulator relieved itself of all the risks associated with the analysis of submitted documents and the acceptance of collateral, and became a second-tier quasi-bank. Although, of course, before the start of each of the projects, the National Bank carefully studied many documents related to it. This was done by the International Credit Lines Project Management Team. She had hands-on experience in application analysis. In agreement with the IMF, the National Bank approved the maximum limit for the issue of money for long-term refinancing, 1 billion hryvnia. This was necessary because the fund saw the threat of inflation as a result of the inclusion of the printing press. However, experience has shown that the issuance of refinancing did not affect consumer prices. The NBU exhausted the limit at the end of 2003 and on the wave of success suspended the project. Later there were rumors that long-term refinancing was blocked by the IMF. In fact, Sergei Tijipko and I ourselves decided to abandon the project. The fact is that we have been receiving too many proposals and even demands for refinancing very strange events. Particularly strong pressure on the NBU was exerted by individual characters from the presidential administration. They wanted to get money for the reconstruction of the Artek pioneer camp. Once I was summoned by Sergei Leonidovich. In his hands he had one of the proposals, which required long-term refinancing. As a former lawyer, I read the document and immediately understood that we were talking about a guaranteed non-return. The money was supposed to go to the accounts of several shell structures, and there was no talk of any reconstruction of Artek. Arseniy Yatsenyuk was complained to the president as a man who refused to help children. I directly told Tijipko that we should not get involved with this. After my dismissal from the NBU, my former boss called me. Tijipko was worried about the issue of Artek. Stelmak called him and said that a criminal case had been opened in this case. Tijipko asked if we had issued refinancing. I remember how happy I was. If we extradited, we would already be in prison, I replied. After the incident with Artek, Tijipko and I conferred and decided that we helped the economy, but we won't help individuals because nothing worthwhile comes out of any good idea with the Ukrainian structure of power. And banned long-term refinancing. I suspect that a lot of people were upset when they heard about it. In addition to making global decisions in those years, I had to deal with minor technical problems. Literally from the start of the fight against gaps, I discovered that the National Bank does not know exactly what is happening in the resource market. There was no way to find out with the help of reporting, only dealers of commercial banks owned real information. They worked immediately through 3 information systems, Ukardilink, Interbusiness Consulting, and Reuters, while transactions were made by phone. I set myself a personal task to find out what the actual rates are on the interbank market. Reuters then installed 2 working terminals at the National Bank as part of a promotion. One of them was in the office of the first deputy chairman. In addition, I personally subscribed to the services of Ukardilink and Interbusiness Consulting and was registered with them under the nickname National Bank. Dealers very soon found out that Yatsenyuk was watching the course of the auction and began to distort information through a system of special keys. For example, instead of 1.8%, 180% appeared on the monitor. In addition, speculators who bought the hryvnia in one place and immediately resold it in another seriously distorted the reporting. In order to stop these phenomena, Natalia Grebenik and I decided to force banks to show all transactions for the purchase and sale of resources on the interbank market, both for loans and for repo transactions and other instruments. To make it more convenient to process data, we had an idea to make a special electronic reporting form. NBU technical specialists quickly developed an information system for the interbank market, which they called Credinfo. We decided to send this system to banks free of charge in order to avoid accusations of profit. Credinfo was put into operation in May 2004, and the decision on the introduction of the system was signed in January. Banks resisted for a long time and complained that the software did not work or crashed. They even came up with the idea that it is impossible to enter information about transactions within 10 minutes, because this will slow down the work of the interbank market. Indeed, at first the system was crude, but after completion, the arguments about the technical imperfection of Credinfo disappeared. When the passion subsided and we were already celebrating the victory, it turned out that the banks managed to distort even the information that had to be entered into Credinfo. In addition to interest for the use of resources, they began to charge a commission fee, which was used for other types of reporting. Lawyers of the National Bank rummaged through the legislation and wrote an explanation, the essence of which was to ban commissions for such transactions. In July 2004, we sent out this clarification, signed by me, by telegram. There were no more problems with Credinfo, and the national bank got a tool for tracking true interest rates in the resource market. Thus, the fight against gaps was carried out in several directions and turned out to be quite successful. By the middle of 2004, the active-passive policy of banks had changed radically. Institutions were ready for new liquidity crises and proved it in the autumn. Until now, the length of their liabilities is significantly less than the terms for which loans are issued. However, these are qualitatively different liabilities. Among them, the share of deposits of the population and foreign loans is very large. Lending at the expense of funds from the interbank market has long been out of fashion. The crisis of confidence in Russia became a test for the stability of the Ukrainian banking system. In mid-May 2004, the license of Sodbusinessbank, which was suspected of money laundering, was revoked. Together with him, CB Credit Trust came under investigation. This incident would have gone unnoticed, but soon rumors spread throughout the financial market of the Russian Federation that licenses would be revoked from other banks that were already included in a kind of blacklist. Several lists were even published on the internet and in one of the central newspapers, calling them the same blacklists. Russian banks immediately closed the limits on mutual transactions. Simply put, they stopped lending to each other. As a result, interest rates rose sharply on the Russian resource market, and the population rushed to withdraw money from deposits. In June 2004, Sergei Tijipko personally contacted the chairman and two first deputy chairmen of the Russian Central Bank. We tried to understand what risks the June situation in the Russian Federation bears. For the Ukrainian financial system, the Russian crisis was dangerous due to two circumstances. First, many domestic banks borrowed large amounts of dollars from Russians, so the closure of this source led to an increase in rates by 1 to 2% on interbank loans in foreign currency. However, after 2 or 3 weeks, the turbulence in the market subsided, and the cost of resources returned to its previous levels. I only briefly mentioned the second circumstance that disturbs us to the press. Problems may arise for those who, in pursuit of the rising ruble, have placed free funds in Russian banks. At the height of the crisis in the Russian Federation, I instructed to calculate the balance of assets and liabilities in the operations of banks in the two countries. It turned out not to be in our favor. Ukrainian banks were actively attracting resources in Russia, but they also kept orders of magnitude larger amounts on correspondent accounts in Russian rubles. The reason was simple: the ruble at that time was rising in price against the dollar, and it was profitable to hold it. This led to the fact that in the midst of the crisis, many Ukrainian banks frozen resources on correspondent accounts in the Russian Federation. We were worried that partners from Russia would not be included in the list of financially insolvent and the money would not disappear forever. All this was reminiscent of the events of 1998, when I worked at Aval and collected overdue debts on correspondent account balances from bankrupt Russian banks. I remember how I returned money with ATMs, POS terminals, and Gazprom bonds with an 85% discount. As it turned out, in 2004 there was nothing to be afraid of. The maximum delay lasted only 2 days, and Ukrainian banks did not even feel any inconvenience. Hunt for Washer. When in November 2004 the NBU struggled with the crisis in the foreign exchange market, the experience of dealing with the withdrawal of capital from the country and with banks that were engaged in laundering operations was very useful. This work was carried out incessantly, because we saw in both phenomena a potential danger to the system, especially on the eve of the presidential elections. Back in the summer of 2003, the National Bank closed anonymous currency accounts and coded accounts of individuals. Both through those and through others, large turnovers were carried out to cash out funds obtained dishonestly. In 2003, these loopholes were hardly exploited anymore, but we decided to do away with coded and anonymous accounts once and for all. The next stage, during which everyone could lose their posts, was the fight against schemes for the withdrawal of capital abroad. The most common at that time were transactions with securities and pseudo-import. On January 29, 2003, the National Bank took the first step by banning transactions for the purchase of foreign currency on the interbank market of the country under agreements between residents and non-residents on the purchase and sale of securities. Sergei Tijipko then personally drew in front of the cameras the principle of the scheme. In general terms, she looked like this. The Ukrainian company was selling the shares of the company to an offshore company. And then, seeing that the papers were promising, they bought them back, but at a higher price. The required amount went abroad. The National Bank succeeded in blocking this channel for the withdrawal of capital by forcing it to obtain an individual license from the regulator to transfer foreign currency for each such operation. However, soon the craftsmen found a way to circumvent the restriction. NBU Decree No. 36 on transactions with securities of Ukrainian issuers stated that transactions with non-resident legal entities are subject to licensing. Banks began to withdraw money on transactions with non-resident individuals. I had to issue a second resolution, by which the National Bank forced to receive individual permission for such operations. However, even after that, the effect of the introduction of the restriction was small. Over time, schemes were found to bypass it. Capital has no boundaries. The positive was that we at least began to oppose the withdrawal of money. About a year later, the NBU blocked another channel for capital outflow. Decree No. 597 of December 30, 2003 tightened the procedure for purchasing foreign currency to pay for work, services, and intellectual property rights with a delay in delivery. To carry out such operations, the NBU began to require the presence of an active price expertise from Form on the compliance of the prices specified in the contract with the world level. The initiative had a great effect. At the beginning of 2004, the National Bank stated that due to the overlap of these schemes, the outflow of capital abroad was reduced fourfold. Unfortunately, our team did not have time to close the most popular of the remaining outflow channels, through pseudo-import, when goods were paid for, but the goods were not actually imported into the country. Usually a false customs declaration was drawn up, which indicated the fact of import, or an advance payment was made, after which the foreign supplier did not fulfill its obligations. But we managed to draw the attention of the authorities to this problem. Since 2004, the National Bank has changed the method of balance of payments. Our experts compared bank payments with data on the import of goods into the customs territory of the country and found that according to pseudo-import schemes, only in the first quarter of 2004, $1,365 million flowed out of Ukraine. In total, the outflow amounted to $4.5 billion in a year. There was no response from the authorities. The channel remains open to this day. Another component of the fight against the withdrawal of capital was the overlapping of schemes for banks that carried out laundering operations. Before the start of the campaign, we were aware that this phenomenon is an integral attribute of the modern Ukrainian economy with a huge shadow sector. It was impossible to completely eradicate the pumping of capital abroad. Common sense said that if there is a demand for a service, there will always be someone who will provide it. A lot of people have been doing this. And yet there were banks that made all this a core business, conducting dubious operations on an especially large scale. It was with them that we decided to fight. For some time, the NBU tried to establish contact with supervisory authorities abroad. I personally signed dozens of letters addressed to foreign central banks. The regulator did not receive a response. As it turned out, no one wanted to take on new obligations or simply tell that they had problems. We came to the conclusion that international cooperation in the fight against money laundering is a myth and you have to rely only on your own strength. Formally, the Financial Monitoring Service has been operating in the country for the second year. In 2004 alone, banks reported more than 500,000 suspicious transactions to her. However, the financial monitoring system only collected information, having no practical leverage on violators. She was supposed to transfer the collected data to the prosecutor's office, but it would hardly have come to a court verdict. Therefore, within the National Bank, we created a special division, which we called Financial Intelligence. A small team kept a close eye on the institutions and schemes that were being used for the laundering. Several clauses in the law on financial monitoring allowed the NBU to legally engage in such investigations. It turned out that about 10 banks are carrying out dubious operations on an especially large scale throughout the country. These were predominantly small institutions. Large structures did not want to risk their reputation. The order of work with violators was as follows: typical laundering schemes were identified, all information on the bank and its customers was analyzed, and then measures were taken. It was necessary to obtain information in the most amazing ways. For example, we bought pirated copies of tax inspection databases on the market with our own money. We managed to agree on the exchange of information with customs back in 2003. Warnings were sent to banks, indicating that such and such clients were conducting dubious transactions. The NBU asked to suspend all transactions with them until the circumstances are clarified and to provide the available information on clients for analysis. From the data obtained, it turned out, for example, that a one-day firm registered as a war invalid with a certificate from a psychiatric clinic wanted to buy large amounts of foreign currency to pay for a foreign economic contract. As a rule, after the investigation, the National Bank referred the cases to the prosecutor's office and the SBU. However, we did not wait for the reaction of law enforcement officers and independently applied serious sanctions to violating banks. For example, they were fined for illegal operations carried out by their clients. The relevant Resolution No. 108 of the NBU was adopted on March 17, 2004. It states that the legal basis for imposing sanctions is the law on preventing and combating the legalization, laundering, of proceeds from crime. In July of the same year, by Resolution No. 323, the National Bank adopted large-scale changes to the rules for conducting operations in the interbank foreign exchange market. The document banned the purchase of non-cash currency from the NBU by 8 institutions that were engaged in laundering on an especially large scale. They were supposed to send detailed information on the applications of each of the clients who were suspected of conducting dubious transactions. To avoid lawsuits, we at the same time renegotiated the contracts for participation in the trading session with all other banks, introducing the necessary clauses that allowed them to be sanctioned. The NBU celebrated its victory until it became clear at the end of October that the volume of foreign currency purchases for export abroad began to grow. We checked the details of clients and found out, violating banks have learned to bypass the NBU restriction. They began to buy currency from the regulator through intermediaries. It turned out a little more expensive, but the method worked. I had to adopt Decree No. 499, which prohibited the purchase of foreign currency from the regulator through other banks. We literally cut off the oxygen to violators. The board of the NBU spent especially a lot of energy on a small Chernihiv bank, through which laundries from many regions of the country worked. Our confrontation boiled down to answering a simple question: is the regulator capable of counteracting the outflow of capital abroad? We sent letters to the Prosecutor General's office and the SBU, in which we described everything that happened in this bank and asked the tax authorities to help. However, they sat back and watched with interest how it would all end. Already after the Orange Revolution, the former head of the SBU, Igor Smeshko, trying to earn the trust of the new government, said that he had discovered a large washing room. He even published in the newspaper one of the secret documents on the Chernihiv bank from the package that we once sent to the SBU. There was no help from law enforcement agencies, and the National Bank had to solve this problem on its own. We blocked the Chernihiv bank's channels for exporting foreign currency. At the end of 2004, the NBU dismissed the chairman of the board of the bank and imposed numerous sanctions on the institution, forbidding it to work with foreign individuals. Later, we removed this bank from carrying out operations on the foreign exchange market. There was even a criminal case. For a while, the institution invented new laundering mechanisms, and in less than a month, we threw it off the market. Imagine our surprise when all the clients of a dozen of the washers, covered by us, after a short time, surfaced in one large Kiev bank. They were in such a hurry that they did not even change their names. In 1 month, these enterprises bought a record-breaking amount of foreign currency. The NBU board sent a warning to the bank serving them that it has clients who carry out dubious transactions. However, there was no reaction. Then we took the case to court, and the court forbade the bank to buy foreign currency for more than 60,000 hryvnias. On the same day, the performers briefed the bank on the fateful decision. In the evening of the same day, the telephone rang in my office, and the languid voice of the owner of the penal institution was heard from the receiver. "Well, should I wind up and close the bank?" he asked. I feigned surprise and asked what happened. "You have forbidden us all operations," he replied. And then I began to prove to him that it was not we who banned it, but he himself purposefully led the bank to such a denouement. A day or two later, this man came to my office and again raised the topic of the ban. I gave him a detailed breakdown of the clients and told him exactly what operations they carried out. More than $1 billion in shady transactions were carried out through his bank in just a month. The man was silent and, only when he left my office, he suddenly said, "I just really need money." The word, very, was given special emphasis. I couldn't find an answer. The most surprising thing is that the Chernihiv washing is still working. After the imposition of sanctions, we had a serious talk with the owners of the institution and were even ready to compromise if they gave the merchants word of honor that the laundering operations would stop. However, they insisted that all transactions were legal, despite the abundance of evidence from the NBU. Then Alexander Schlapak sent an unscheduled check to the bank in order to finally double-check all the facts and transfer the case to the prosecutor's office. However, by some miracle, the chairman of the board managed to convince the new head of the National Bank to take the auditors out of there. A day after they appeared in the Chernihiv Bank, without completing the check, they were personally recalled by Vladimir Stelmak. A week later, the institution was given back the right to buy foreign currency. Fortunately, this curiosity happened already at the end of the autumn crisis. The rigidity of the NBU government benefited the entire financial system. The 2-year battles allowed the National Bank to work out mechanisms that did not exist before. During the autumn crisis of 2004, literally everything came in handy, both internal intelligence, and the new regulatory framework, and the methodology for checking clients. The blow to the washers in the midst of the crisis helped to save a huge part of the gold and foreign exchange reserves. Thanks to its best practices, the National Bank managed to avoid excessive capital outflow, which would invariably be followed by the depletion of foreign exchange reserves and a sharp devaluation of the hryvnia. The National Bank had to be rebuilt. There is no need to idealize the state of the NBU itself. Of course, our team received from its predecessors a well-oiled mechanism that already functioned on its own. However, only members of the board, heads of departments and territorial offices of the National Bank were conscious. Most of the employees, especially in the regions, had to be forced to work. Arseniy Yatsenyuk was probably remembered as a deputy chairman who constantly called someone into his office and read it out. First of all, I had to tighten the rules for working with documents. The National Bank was in complete disarray with regard to secrecy. Too many had access to regime papers. We had to clearly regulate the workflow and limit the number of subscribers to our data. In general, the main problem was far from people. It was difficult to work because the regulator did not have a single database that would allow to quickly monitor the processes taking place in the banking system. In part, we have made life difficult for ourselves. Having come to the NBU, our team cancelled many forms of bank reporting as unnecessary. These initiatives were met with approval by the financial world, but very soon we felt an acute lack of information. In addition, we could not use the available data. The NBU had a lot of information, but a third of it was never processed. It's just that the data existed on paper and no one knew exactly where everything was. Therefore, we started with the introduction of electronic reporting systems, as well as with the creation of a system of total monitoring of the entire banking system. An integral part of the innovations was the already mentioned CredInfo, as well as the database of banking supervision dossier of banks. The Department of Informatization of Anatoly Sobchenko gradually developed new software and eventually brought all the available information into a single whole. The result of many months of work was a database in which many indicators were updated in real time. The fact that the representatives of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank could not believe that this was possible already spoke of the high level of professionalism of the creators. At the beginning of 2004, there was a special terminal with 4 monitors in the office of the first deputy chairman of the NBU. By highlighting any bank with the cursor, I could immediately get detailed information about its current state. For example, I saw how much money an institution has on correspondent accounts by currency, what volume of deposits and loans it has with an indication of interest rates, what it buys and what it sells, how it meets the standards. For many indicators, data for past periods were entered into the database, and it was possible to build graphs that showed the work of any bank over time. The first persons in the banking system could manage it precisely because they were 100% informed. The system had proven its usefulness many times before the fall of 2004. Often bankers came to me to complain about my own subordinates or ask for help. In 30 seconds, I could see on the monitor the true situation in the bank: bad loans, imbalances in assets and liabilities, active financing of insiders. Thanks to detailed information, it was possible to make very correct decisions on controversial issues, because now I knew just as well as the head of the bank how things were going with him. Once the system was useful to me during a government meeting. Speaking from the rostrum in front of the entire cabinet of ministers, the ex-mayor of Kiev, Alexander Omelchenko, complained that the National Bank was not working efficiently enough and was not giving the capital money for development. While he was talking, I dialed one of the supervisors from my mobile phone, and he literally dictated some numbers to me from the screen. When the presiding First Deputy Prime Minister Mykola Azarov gave me the floor, I said the following: as of 12:30 today, on the accounts of the Kiev City Administration in the Crescent Bank there was such and such an amount received from such and such pairs for such and such a period. Among other funds, I mentioned several $100 million that were left over from the issue of Eurobonds and were not spent. I still can't forget how Azarov looked at Omelchenko. Having come to the National Bank, our team was faced with the fact that the regulatory framework for the work of the regulator was very heterogeneous. The same area was sometimes regulated by dozens of regulations, and it was necessary to spend a lot of time studying them. Such, for example, was the situation with the interest rate policy of the National Bank or active-passive operations. We decided to rework the regulatory framework, and as a result, instead of dozens of regulations, one systemic one was created. The National Bank needed administrative reform. For it to take place, it was necessary to evaluate all the problems within the structure. In early 2004, the idea came up to create risk factor maps that would highlight vulnerabilities within the NBU itself, from importing foreign currency to printing banknotes or bookkeeping. After analyzing the completed maps, internal resolutions were adopted in which solutions to the identified problems were prescribed. In order to control risks in the current mode, in March 2003, a single center of responsibility for ongoing operations was created within the structure of the NBU, the Asset and Liability Management Committee, ALC, of the National Bank. Its main task was to make unified decisions on issues that were within the competence of different structural divisions. For example, prior to the creation of the ALMC, the Department of Monetary Policy was in charge of refinancing, the Department of Currency Regulation managed foreign exchange reserves, and these types of activities did not correlate with each other. In any bank, there is a treasury for these purposes, which decides where to get the missing resources and where to put the excess ones for a while. We decided to create a similar division within the NBU. To avoid internal conflicts, the committee included the directors of all departments conducting active and passive operations. I headed the committee, Lydia Voronova was the secretary. Once every 2 weeks, we got together and very lively discussed issues related to the movement of financial flows of the regulator and especially complex problems in the work. All the results of the meetings were formalized by the resolutions of the NBU board with the stamp, Bank Secrecy. We later introduced a similar communication procedure in our work with the territorial branches of the National Bank. Once a month, the board held a conference call, which also practiced live communication on important issues. The heads of regional departments could express their position and even argue. Of course, there were many skeptics who regularly asked, "Is this a production? Do you need to follow the plan?" However, practice has shown that the central office, through communication with the regions, could get a clear idea of the trends or individual cases that occurred in the banking sector and make prompt decisions. And the regions found out what was going on in other areas and used it in their work. In April 2003, we added regular Friday meetings to the ALMC. They were attended by all the heads of departments who reported to me as the first deputy chairman of the NBU. During these meetings, we discussed all current issues and made forecasts for the behavior of the monetary market for the next week. Collegiality allowed making optimal decisions in each specific case. On the last Friday of the month, meetings were held in an expanded format. Middle managers in the central office of the National Bank were also invited to them. Similar meetings eventually began to be held by the other deputy chairman of the NBU. In the law on the National Bank, the new board found a clause that the regulator is responsible for the operation of the banking system during a special period. However, it turned out that we did not have a single document that could be taken as a basis during the war or general mobilization. We decided to eliminate this shortcoming. A working group was created, which included representatives of all departments of the NBU. 2 people headed the project, Lydia Voronova and Igor Chernik. The group took up the development of regulations on the functioning of banks in a special period. I remember that no one took the idea seriously. Everyone understood that there would be no war. However, this did not prevent us from modeling crisis situations and coming up with ways out of them. In the end, a man-made disaster, similar to the explosion at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, could well have occurred. As a result, during 2003, 33 resolutions were issued, which approved the relevant provisions and rules. They concerned making payments, reporting, storing documents, organizing cash handling, forming material and technical reserves, and other activities that could come in handy during a war or mobilization. All of these resolutions were classified as off the record because open publication in an election year could cause a mixed reaction from banks and politicians. Once, due to the negligence of one of the NBU employees, they forgot to put the appropriate stamp on resolution number 444, on approving the regulations on the procedure for termination, stopping, restricting the activities of banks during a special period, and after registration with the Ministry of Justice on October 5, 2004, it was published. Unfortunately, this happened on the very eve of the presidential elections. With the light hand of the deputy chairman of one of the subsidiary Western banks, a big scandal arose. The document stated that even before the start of the special period, the NBU selects institutions that are allowed to work in the country. The deputy chairman began to call all banks with foreign capital and say that the NBU wants to withdraw money from them, and for this it introduces a state of emergency. The wave of hysteria also spread to Ukrainian banks. Viktor Lisitsky, who was then working for Private Bank on the air of Channel 5, commented by phone that Serhiy Tijipko and Viktor Yanukovych were sitting in the National Bank, who wanted to introduce martial law. After that, the director of the General Department of Banking Supervision, Vadim Pushkarev, was forced to communicate with television people and convince them that all this was not true. He drew their attention to. I had to call an emergency press conference, at which an almost legendary phrase was heard: "If I have a gas mask in my office, this does not mean that I come to the office every morning and put it on." With these words, I tried to explain to the press the reason for the appearance of the decrees on the introduction of a special period. At the same time, the NBU gathered the heads of Western banks in its large conference room. The conversation lasted about 2 hours, during which I told the story of the creation of the decrees and explained that these documents would be used as a guide to action only at the most critical moments. I apologized to the Western bankers and offered, if necessary, to personally write letters to their main offices explaining the situation in detail. The instigator of the scandal was present there and was the only one who screamed. Working on these regulations has been as beneficial as completing the risk maps. Modeling crisis situations, experts have identified many bottlenecks in the work of the National Bank. As problems were found, we tried to fix them. For example, it turned out that the NBU did not have autonomous power supply and communication systems. If the electricity and telephone lines of Ukrtelecom were turned off, we would find ourselves in an information blockade. Therefore, powerful uninterruptible power supplies were installed in the central building of the National Bank on Institutska Street and in all territorial departments. Satellite communication channels have been established between the territorial branches of the NBU, and in parallel, a communication system between all commercial banks was being prepared for launch. This was extremely necessary, because confidential information had to be transmitted over open communication channels, and this was not secure. The Department of Informatization of Anatoly Savchenko has developed a project according to which closed telephone lines, similar to government communications, would be extended to all banks. In the largest 10 banks, it was planned to additionally install video selectors. By the end of 2004, the NBU had already installed a system that made it possible to conduct video conferences with the regions, but we did not have time to use it. Immediately after the installation of satellite communications with the territorial administrations, we received confirmation of the correctness of our actions. Ukrtelecom turned off communication in the Kharkiv direction, to which 5 regional departments of the NBU were connected. Only duplicating communication channels allowed to avoid problems. The preparations of the National Bank turned out to be far from useful. In November 2004, everything came in handy: secrecy, autonomous communication, enhanced security measures, and even more so the presence of a unified information system for the activities of banks. ALMC meetings, workshops, selectors, and regular meetings of the board of the National Bank created the basis for collegial decision-making. Thanks to this, we were not at a loss in a crisis situation. We were able to comprehensively assess the problems and give adequate instructions. Perhaps, during the financial crisis, the regulator could have worked without all these attributes, relying on the luck and professionalism of its employees. I can only object to this with one statement that I heard a year after leaving the National Bank. Someone said, "Fortresses are always built during a truce." I am convinced that during the 2 years of invisible work we really turned the NBU into a kind of fortress that helped the banks to hold out during the financial crisis of November-December 2004.